Well, 50,000 Nevadans are currently living with Alzheimer's, and that number is only expected to skyrocket over the next decade. Well, coming up on Nevada Week, we'll explore how close local researchers are to a cure, plus what role citizen scientists and caregivers play toward fighting this neurodegenerative disease.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstat, Cashman Equipment, and additional supporting sponsors.
It's estimated over 44 million people across the globe are living with Alzheimer's, yet to this day, there is still no cure. Nevada is projected to be one of the top 3 states in the U.S. to see a growth in diagnosis over the next decade. To combat this degenerative disease, local researchers are working feverishly in collaboration with patients and caregivers. To take a closer look at where the research is and how local policy and funding is impacting the fight for a cure, we are joined by Dr. Jeffrey Cummings, research professor in the UNLV Department of Brain Health, Dr. Jefferson Kinney, associate professor and founding chair of the UNLV Department for Brain Health, Leanne Mandarino, Program Manager for Education, Outreach, and Advocacy at the Cleveland Clinic Lou Rouveau Center, and Kat Hartley, Caregiver and Project Manager at the Cleveland Clinic Lou Rouveau Center. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Jeff, I want to start with you. In layman's terms, can you give us an idea, physiologically, what is happening with Alzheimer's disease to the brain, but also the body?
So in Alzheimer's disease, Kip, the nerve cells that control our memory and our thinking are gradually dying. And they're dying because 2 different types of proteins that are normally present accumulate to too great an extent and kill the nerve cells gradually over about a decade. And the person then loses their capacity to think and to function during that time. A fascinating advance that we've just learned in the last 5 years is that those proteins are accumulating over a very long period of time, about 2 decades in the brain before people begin to show symptoms. And that has changed our world because it now means we can think about prevention because we know who's on the pathway to getting Alzheimer's disease.
And that's a good point. Jeff, I want to ask you then, let's talk about diagnosis then. I mean, how is something like this commonly diagnosed, and over maybe the last 5 years, has that evolved?
So it absolutely has evolved, and as Jeff and a number of other clinicians have really started to employ more approaches than just the clinical inventory to identify patients. There's a huge push in this research and in the clinical world for better biomarkers to be able to detect characteristics of the disease that would allow detection long before you start seeing the cognitive impairments that were the diagnosis in decades past. This ranges from imaging to blood-based biomarkers, and it's all being combined now with the strength of clinical interactions to get better and earlier diagnoses.
Can you explain what a blood-based biomarker is? Is this the proteins that we're talking about?
Yeah, so it gets a little difficult in Alzheimer's disease because the 2 core pathologies that you see in the brain are difficult to detect in peripheral blood. You can detect them from cerebral spinal fluid, but of course that presents a different hurdle in and of itself. So what a number of groups are really working on is trying to find markers associated with those features, with the amyloid and the tau. Those are the 2 core features. In addition, there's a lot of work going into finding markers around inflammation and some other characteristics of the disease in blood samples that would allow for a cleaner and more accurate diagnosis.
And there's one really great one that's evolving because as the nerve cells die, they do release a marker into the blood. And now we can see that marker with the kind of laboratory tests that Jeff does at UNLV. And the great thing is this marker marks any disease in which the nerve cells are being injured. So it goes from spinal muscular atrophy in infants to Alzheimer's disease in an octogenarian. Yeah. Anytime there's nerve cell loss, there is this protein appearing in the blood. That gives us a wonderful window to work on neuroprotection.
So that protein might just not signify that there's Alzheimer's disease down the road. It could be a whole series of potential neurodegenerative diseases. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Anytime there's a nerve injury, even multiple sclerosis, for example, which we don't think of as a degenerative disease, because there's nerve injury, it will force this marker up into the blood. And that, when we have markers, then we have targets. And that's why it's so informative and so helpful.
Kat, let's talk about risk factors here, right? Age for Alzheimer's disease, I think everybody understands, is a major risk factor here, but maybe there's other ones that we're not necessarily aware of. What are some of the other risk factors we have?
Well, age is the #1 risk factor for dementia, but also there is a genetic component. And we're really starting to understand the significance of our lifestyle habits as well in the development of the disease. How important how much we exercise and what we're eating is impacting what's happening in our brain over a course of a lifetime.
Leanne, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you mentioned risk factors, and I think it's important to sort of highlight that there's this growing body of research of trying to understand how these risk factors confer added risk, a change, something associated with Alzheimer's disease. And this is something that's really grown in the last 10 years from diabetes and age-associated change, inflammation, cardiovascular health. These are a number of things that change the risk for developing the disease, and there's a lot of research now at trying to determine how those risk factors confer risk into the underlying biology. And part of that is even useful towards these biomarker targets to be able to identify them.
And let's jump into research. We're going to dive into a little bit more in a sec, but that's a good point too, because research isn't just about a cure. We're talking about ways to diagnose, ways to prevent, ways to treat. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the research spans everything from understanding the underlying biology to how to identify it, how to treat it, how to develop new therapeutics, better quality of care, arresting the progression of the disorder, and in time halting it. And what it translates to is an enormous number of projects, an enormous number of possibilities, and we have to sift through from mechanism through the clinic and find ways to integrate that into what is the most productive.
And I think this is so important because your taxpayer is sitting out there, I think, watching and saying, well, why am I supporting all of this research? And I think it's so important for the person to know that research results in better lives. That's why we have vaccinations now. That's why we have better cardiovascular care now. That's why we have better longevity now. We're living long enough to have these neurodegenerative diseases, so they represent the next hurdle that we have to address. But there is a direct relationship between performing research and improving people's lives. And that's what it's about.
And let's talk more about the impact here too, more broadly. Leanne, the economic impact of something like this, $200 billion, the cost of Alzheimer's now, projected potentially in even 5 years to top $1 trillion is what I was reading. I mean, can we put some context on what the economic impact is of a disease like this, maybe just in Nevada alone?
Well, overall, we spend $277 billion a year for Alzheimer's disease care, and $186 billion of that is for Medicare and Medicaid services, so that comes directly from our taxpayers, right? And if you look at the individual costs of Alzheimer's disease, when a loved one has Alzheimer's disease, you become a caregiver, and that's a 24/7 job. Nursing home care costs upwards towards $5,000 a month for most families, and who can afford that? So what will happen is the caregiver may have to quit their job. And so this has a snowballing effect. What's going to happen to them when they retire? What's going to happen to their nest egg? So from a very macro to a very micro situation, you're going to have Alzheimer's disease poses a huge cost on our society.
Yeah, to each individual family and then economically as well. Yeah, and Kat, I want to come to you talking about caregivers here. You have personal experience and professional experience in this. I mean, what is the toll on a family when you're dealing with someone that is going through the different phases of Alzheimer's?
Well, I've had Alzheimer's disease in my family for 2 generations now, and from that personal experience, financially, 2 generations of wealth were probably used on the care of my grandparents. Family arguments, how do we care for someone, inadequate support. These impact you in many, many ways, and that's snowball in families. Resources really need to be expanded to help these families manage these difficult and a very emotional and exhausting journey with someone that has Alzheimer's disease.
Jeff, where are we at? Do we project a cure anytime soon?
Well, this is the week to have this discussion because we haven't had a new drug since 2003, and on Tuesday, a company announced that they had sufficient data to approach the FDA for a possible approval for a new treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Now, it's not approved yet, but it means that the program has had enough data generated in terms of clinical trials that the FDA was willing to hear the application, and that's a very good sign. It means that our science has matured to a place where we're doing clinical trials that are slowing the progress of the disease. That's what we can see in the clinical measures. And we're removing the toxic proteins from the brain as we do brain scans. So this was a real breakthrough this week. And there's a second drug. I want to tell you, I'll give you all the good news here. There's a second drug which is being studied in China. It completed a successful trial earlier in the year, and we believe it could be approved within the next few months in China. Now, it won't come to the United States, but it shows that globally, this problem is being taken seriously, and scientists all around the world are looking for new therapies for Alzheimer's disease.
And so these drugs are not necessarily a cure-all, but this is the first steps of a cure-all. Am I hearing that correctly, or is this a potential
That's exactly
cure?
right.
Yeah.
Cure is a very tough word in Alzheimer's disease because it is age-related. We know that it's very difficult for all people to clear these proteins from their brain as they age, and so it's a part of the biology of aging. Not that everybody will get it, but it is related to the biology of aging, and so cure becomes difficult. We don't cure heart disease, really. We don't cure lung disease, and I think Alzheimer's disease is going to fall into that same category of terrific management of chronic disease where people can have a dignified, cognitively intact life until the end of life.
Jeff, we're talking about advancements in China. We're talking about multinational companies, I'm assuming here. But locally, let's talk about the Cleveland Clinic, and let's talk about what's going on at UNLV now with the Department for Brain Health.
Yeah.
I mean, how are those two centers then collaborating with some of these larger global projects?
So the Alzheimer's disease research network is massive, and it has only been getting larger. And in the last decade in particular, more basic researchers and clinical researchers have been pairing up and partnering and advancing the science. And the Department of Brain Health is really just an extension of something that started many years ago. So Jeff and I have been collaborating on different levels for a number of years between work we were doing at UNLV on basic research mechanisms and developing these biomarker approaches and the clinical trial work that is so exceptional at the Ruvo Center. And as time has passed and we have made some progress, there was the opportunity to really build a department that was focused on brain health, on neurodegenerative disorders, and it adds to a number of other initiatives at UNLV for neuroscience and the training of graduate students of the next generation of researchers. And this all sort of arose out of some very successful early collaborations that now span into biomarker discovery and clinical trials, a Center of Excellence grant that Jeff is the head of that's between Cleveland Clinic and UNLV, and a number of other research projects that just keep emerging both locally and with collaborators all over the nation.
I want to jump to the role, we're talking about clinical trials here, and jump to the role of the patient here as a participant in these clinical trials.
You know, I saw the door open and I walked in.
From her fast wit and sassy humor, you probably wouldn't be able to tell Nancy has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
My attitude is that I don't have Alzheimer's, I've been diagnosed with it.
In 2012, Nancy was diagnosed with early onset and was later re-diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. Shortly after her diagnosis, she joined the Cleveland Clinic Center for Biomedical Research Excellence, or COBRE study. The study utilizes PET scans to understand how this disease affects the brain.
They're looking at different ways of earlier diagnosing Alzheimer's.
Pam is also a participant, but unlike Nancy, she doesn't have Alzheimer's. Instead, she's part of the control group, a group vital to completing this research.
When you realize how many people are suffering with this and there's no cure, and there in many cases aren't a lot of answers, how can you not help?
Pam was drawn toward brain research participation after caring for her mom, who is currently in full-time care for Alzheimer's.
Being a caregiver has made me a kinder, more patient person.
Both Pam and Nancy are sharing their kindness the best way they know possible, by giving up part of their time to work toward a cure.
I think if we all help in the way that we feel good about, then we get more out of it, the study gets more out of it, and hopefully we're going to get farther down this path.
I would say just look at what you want your life to be when you get older. And do you want to be laying in bed, going to doctors, taking lots of medications, or do you want to be running around with your grandkids and your great-grandkids?
Let's join hands. The more the merrier, and we will find a solution.
Leanne, this is something that the Cleveland Clinic is spending a lot of time in the recruitment side. We've also had some legislation pass that is supporting this. Why is this so critical to research?
Recruiting patients, you can't do it without the patients, and it's a very difficult thing to do with Alzheimer's disease because there's a lot involved in bringing them to a clinical trial. They have to have a caregiver with them, and so there's a commitment on part of the caregiver as well. But what we try to do in my department is to go out and provide education on why this is necessary for the health of not only the person that may have dementia. There may be something we could do to help them forestall worsening of symptoms, but also for their children and grandchildren. And we need all types, we need all races, we need all cultures to be involved, because what works for one may not work for the other. We need men, we need women, and so our goal is to go out into these communities and apprise them of why it is so important that they become involved in these drug trials.
And Leanne, are we looking just at patients, or are we looking at the general public to kind of get an idea of where diagnosis is early on, early detection?
We need everybody to be involved. I started with this group about 10 years ago or more, and I never thought about my brain health before, although I probably should have. But I think that that's still an issue. Who thinks about their brain health when you're 30, 20, 30, 40, and nothing's wrong with you? But it is something we really should consider at every age.
Yep, and Kat, you also are very heavily involved in the education side of this, but also the recruitment on the
Yes.
And so my question is, for our viewership out there, how do we get in touch with you to potentially be in a clinical trial?
Well, we have a number you can call at the center, and then you can email us at healthybrains@ccf.org. And then we will have someone contact you and discuss the options. And each trial has inclusion and exclusion criteria, so there's a little bit of a screening process that happens when you're interested in a clinical trial. We do have a registry that holds individuals who are interested in our clinical research called healthybrains.org. And it acts as both an education tool to educate the public about lifestyle and brain health, but also serves as a tool to engage people and understand what kind of research we have available. So that's a very helpful tool that we've been able to develop.
And Jeff, I'm sorry, please.
Well, I'm just, I want to make the point about how important clinical trials are and the participation of the public in clinical trials. It's the only way that we can advance drugs, because the FDA only accepts one kind of information, which is information from clinical trials. So unless we want to have the therapies now in 10 years, we've got to do clinical trials. That's the only way forward. So it's so important that people understand that they get great care in clinical trials, they really get engaged with their doctors in clinical trials. They're making a contribution that could change the future of humanity by doing clinical trials. And they could help their own families, because their families are at risk by the very fact that they have Alzheimer's disease or the precursor of Alzheimer's disease. So there are many, many reasons to get in clinical trials, and right now far too few people participate. Right now, if we do a 6-month trial, it takes us a year to recruit for that trial. So it takes us 18 months to get through a 6-month trial. That's ridiculous. We really need people to come in and be part of it. Jeff can't cure Alzheimer's disease. I can't cure Alzheimer's disease. We can cure it as a team where we all work together, and we have to have the patients and caregivers as part of that team.
Well, Jeff, maybe let's
yeah,
please,
for a second that, and it's very important more than ever that these trials are culturally diverse and that they truly represent everyone. So there's been a great effort in trying to assure that we have our rich cultural diversity of Nevada represented in these trials. We're seeking advice from the community with community advisory boards to direct us on how to overcome obstacles and fear.
Right, and we can't dispel all myths, but let's try. I mean, let's talk about the average individual might be involved in a clinical trial, Jeff. What kind of commitment are we looking at here?
So I will defer a little bit to my clinical trial experts here. It varies by population, it varies by size of trial, but it really comes down to how broad and how specific. But Jeff here is one of the world leaders in clinical trial design.
I'll just say that it does depend, as Jeff suggests, on the specifics of the trial and the drug that we're testing. But in general, the new trials are about 18 months long, so it's a substantial commitment. They have to come in probably at least 5 or 6 times during that period. They will have to have brain imaging and blood drawn during that time. That's why we call them citizen scientists, is because they are really participating in this whole scientific effort, and they're making the most valuable contribution, which is their own body. It's worthwhile, but it is also challenging, and that's why we honor our patients and caregiver participants so much, is because it requires a lot of them.
And Jeff, I'm glad you brought up citizen scientists, Leanne. This is a term nationally. We've seen kind of a movement here with citizen scientists, and it almost seems like almost a crowdsourcing of data, and we're using mobile applications, and there are different ways of mining this data. I mean, how important is this to the research, and how is it different than just kind of a clinical trial participation?
Well, until these guys find a cure for Alzheimer's disease, what we're going to have to really do as a society is manage the disease. We're going to have to teach people that work in restaurants and in police forces and in the hotels and everywhere else, what to look for if somebody has Alzheimer's disease and dementia, because all we could do right now is manage. So what we do is we go out and we teach folks in the business communities and at schools and in faith-based organizations and governmental organizations what the symptoms look like. They don't all look the same for every type of dementia or people that have Alzheimer's disease. If you see one person with Alzheimer's disease, you see one person with Alzheimer's disease. But there are telltale things you can detect and that you can do when you may interact with somebody that has a type of disease. And that's our goal, is really to create a society where people with Alzheimer's disease and dementia and their care partners can live in that community and can navigate that community and participate in all the things that they used to participate in without fear of embarrassment or what have you. And so our group goes and we do community awareness training. We do memory screenings to maybe clue people in that maybe if they take this cognitive screening and have a low score, that they should go to their primary care physician and get checked out or go to a neurologist. Because with Alzheimer's disease, as with any disease, early detection, early diagnosis is the best thing you could do for positive patient outcomes.
Right.
I think it's probably even worth throwing in here, if you forgive me, is that from these clinical trials and the community engagement and a number of the things that are done here, in addition to what they do in a clinical trial to determining if a drug has potential, if it can move to the next phase, if it becomes a cure, there's an enormous wealth of data that comes out of it as well that can then be used for future projects. It can be data mined. When people sign up to be involved in the research, there's the project that is the core of that research endeavor. But it also adds to a greater wealth of data. And as you've heard here, there just aren't enough people to sign up for these trials. Right. The collaborations that have emerged between big data scientists, people that are doing computational models, through cell biologists, through clinicians that have access to more data, it leads to new discoveries, it leads to new approaches, and we learn more about the disease. Yeah. So I often think of this as sort of layered. There's the primary goal of the clinical trial or of a specific experiment, but a wealth of data comes from that, and as people participate, they are advancing the science in a number of different ways.
Right. And we're just about out of time, but what I'm hearing here is for the viewership, and I think if we don't have any intimate involvement with anybody that has Alzheimer's in the next 5 years, we definitely are. The call to action here seems to be, our takeaway is participate in these clinical trials. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, everyone. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, as always, for joining us this week on Nevada Week. Now, if you at home would like to learn more about any of the topics that we covered today, check out our website. That's vegaspbs.org/Nevada-Week. Now, you can also find us on social media at Nevada Week.